Okay. Hey, everybody. Welcome to Illinois Learn to Hunt, deer hunting strategies and stand placement. So I'm Jason Buckley, and I'm here with Dan Stevens. Dan, you want to say hi real quick?
Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight. Happy fall. It's starting to, the temps are dropping, the days are getting shorter, and it's officially fall. So hunting season is just right around the corner. It's exciting.
Yeah, and I'm going to be battling some dogs today. So if I go on mute real quick, it's because someone's driving by, and my wife's at the football game, so I can't put them away really. So hold on. Um, so just some quick reminders as we get started. So you have your microphones and webcams are disabled. If you'd like to reach out and ask a question, you can do that through the chat window or through the Q&A window. So feel free to ask a question as we go along. Either we'll answer it in the chat, or whoever's live presenting can answer it as they're presenting, and we can address it then. Just so you guys know, you'll be getting a copy of this PowerPoint, as well as any infographics that we might have to go along with the webinar. They vary between the webinars that we do. And then you also get a link to this recording on YouTube, as well as a survey that you can fill out to give us some feedback on how the webinar went for you all. So again, at the end of everything, if you think of any questions and you don't ask them as we're going along, we'll be sticking around at the end to answer any questions you may have on the presentation today, or really in general of any questions you might have about hunting in Illinois. We'll be here to answer them for you for sure. So again, our presenters today, we got myself as Jason and Dan. So we're both members of the Illinois Learn to Hunt team. So just some quick outline. So we've already had the past 2 weeks, we had 101 and 102, and this is kind of the follow-up in the series. And we are really excited to have this together for you guys tonight. And this is really I think I just love having information that's practical and you can use it right away instead of it being kind of more of the intro stuff. So you can really take this as a reference and come back to this video and click through to whatever time of year it is, because we're going to go through the seasonality of deer and deer ecology and how that impacts your hunting strategies throughout the year, and then also where you're going to want to set your stand up. So that's basically this whole PowerPoint, is just learning the intricacies of deer movement, the way they use the landscape, and then how you can utilize that to try to put yourself in the right spot where you can get close to being able to hunt these animals, usually with a bow during the most of the time of this year that we're going to be talking about, but and gun season as well. But it's just this good PowerPoint. We like it a lot. So
Yeah, it's
hopefully you
fun.
guys enjoy it. Hopefully you guys enjoy it too. We think it's really practical information. So we can get started. So Dan's going to start us off by talking about habitat.
Yeah, so we'll just kind of quickly dive into habitat a little bit, and then like Jason said, we're really going to dive into some more strategic concepts of how you can look at the landscape and use what the landscape looks like, and also deer behavior and ecology, and how you can really start to develop a really significant hunt plan that can really, like Jason said, put you in the right spot. So deer are fairly general in their habitat needs. A lot of people historically, especially if you watch, different hunting shows or different YouTube hunters, you oftentimes see them in these kind of open mosaic woods that are fairly open with kind of a fairly significant understory. And ideally, that kind of makes sense for filming a TV show. But theoretically, deer really like thick habitat, and so primarily what I'm looking for is an area that has what we consider edge. And so that's in kind of an intersection between two habitat types, right? Whether it's a forest to prairie or a prairie to a wetland, they really like that edge habitat where you have these two habitat types kind of intersecting. Those areas are often rich in both species abundance and diversity for plants and different vegetation that's there. And deer are what's known as browsers. So they will pretty much readily eat just about anything that's available. They'll go from your standard corn and soybean diet to acorns, to even feeding on twigs and the terminal buds of twigs, which is kind of the where the growth spurt starts. And so they're very generalist, but ideally, again, we're looking for kind of these edge habitats and that provides thick cover. That's really kind of the limiting factor in a lot of the landscape in Illinois. Food, not so much an issue. Water is certainly not so much an issue. A lot of times it really boils down to that cover. And a little bit kind of just to re-emphasize deer behavior. Obviously, we're going to dive into the nuts and bolts of all these different topics, but we just kind of want to preface it by a lot of what we're going to talk about today revolves around rut and revolves around the breeding behavior and the breeding ecology of deer. During that time, you're going to see a lot of action in the woods. It kind of opens up. Activity really increases, especially daylight activity. And deer are what's known as crepuscular species. So this means that they're really more active during those kind of twilight hours, rather than midday or mid evening. They really like those crepuscular hours. So right at dawn and kind of right at dusk on the other side. Obviously, deer have an excellent sense of smell, and so a lot of the tactics and strategies that we're going to discuss today is how they utilize that nose, because they will utilize that nose not only focusing on the predominant wind direction, but also using some of these thermals and using the terrain as they can intercept different scent channels blowing around them. And bucks especially will strategically choose bedding locations using these variety of factors so that they can really feel safe and secure in their bedding site. So that's really what we're trying to focus on when we're deer hunting. Obviously, they have pretty good eyesight. They don't see in full color like we do. They kind of see in a little bit of a different spectrum. They do still see some shade of color, but certainly not full color. And obviously, they don't see really well in the orange and red spectrum. So that's why obviously we can wear blaze orange and get away with that. But what their eyes are really attuned to is picking up movement. All right, but now we're going to start getting into the nuts and bolts and the strategies and what we really want to focus on, especially in early season and as we kind of transition out of rut back into late season. One of the primary strategies that we're going to focus on is the bed to feed pattern, and vice versa, the feed to bed pattern. And so once you can identify where deer are actively bedding, where deer are actively feeding, that gives you a really good starting point in trying to pinpoint how they're getting from point A to point B. And that's ideally what we're trying to boil hunting, especially deer hunting, down to, is trying to figure out those travel corridors between point A and point B. So this is kind of a quick example of a bed to feed pattern that I've hunted several times. This is a piece of public land. I actually have a deer right on my desk that I harvested there a few years back. And so the bed to feed pattern can be really effective if you can identify these areas in kind of a strategic way. And what I like to really focus on is what the terrain looks like between a bedding area and a feeding area. And we'll touch on in a little bit more on what a bedding area looks like and what that entails. But I just kind of want to show this quick example here. As you kind of see, we have this little oxbow in the river there. Deer are quite lazy. They don't like to cross over different terrains if they don't have to. They don't like to go up and down steep slopes. And on the south side, kind of right where that X is, we also have a fairly steep slope. And so if you're unfamiliar with topographic maps, you can kind of see these brown kind of snaky lines that kind of meander across that map. Those are essentially what we refer to as contour lines. So those are showing changes in elevation. The closer those lines are together, the steeper that slope is going to be. The further apart they are, the less slope is going to be there. And now I know on this specific map, it doesn't necessarily look like that's a fairly steep slope, but it is, and it's enough of a slope that deer will not like to go up it or down it. And so oftentimes they're just going to follow the natural contours of the land. And so you kind of have this what we consider a funnel or a pinch point where you have these, a fairly steep slope on the south mixed in with the big riverbank on the north, which drops down about 10 or 15 feet. So nothing is going up or down that very easily. And so it just kind of creates this natural funnel point where deer just naturally gravitate towards as they move from a bedding area into a feeding area. And before we move off this slide, I do want to highlight this bedding area a little bit. So when I look at a bedding area or just a field that looks like you can start to see almost, it looks like the forest is kind of starting to reclaim that field. So succession is taking over. It's moving from a grassland to more of a woody, kind of shrubby, herbaceous area. When I see fields like that, that gives me a pretty good indication that does are going to be bedding in there. They really like these kind of grasslands that are mixed with woody, kind of shrubby vegetation. It provides a lot of comfort. And again, does like to bed in numbers. And so they like to have a decent sized bedding area. And I was able to kind of identify that bedding area just by looking at a map. I went through and kind of walked just to confirm that there was actually deer bedding in there, found a few trails, found that funnel, and it's paid off several times. So again, just identifying that bed to feed pattern can be really, really productive. And this is kind of why deer bedding is so important, is just how much of their day is spent bedding. They pretty much spend more time bedding than they do being engaged in any other behavior or any other activity. They don't typically like to bed for just 6 or 7 hours constantly. They're very commonly, they'll bed for 30 minutes to an hour. They'll stand up, they'll feed a little bit, they'll kind of stretch their legs, they'll go pee and poop and do everything they need to do, and then they may be right back in that exact same bed. They may not even go but 15 or 20 feet, just make a quick circle and pop right back down. But they're constantly kind of down and up, kind of down and up. They really don't like to just spend hours and hours in the same bed without moving. Like I kind of mentioned, does really like to bed in numbers. So a buck, when he chooses his bed, he is going to be a lot more reliant on the dominant wind direction, more so than the does, because the does have the ability of having, maybe 8 to even a dozen does all using that same bedding area. And so that gives them a dozen sets of eyes, a dozen sets of ears, and a dozen sets of noses. And so they don't necessarily choose a bed as specifically as a buck will. Now they will certainly pay attention to wind direction and those things, but they will use it even if it's not in the perfect wind direction for them. And they will often, even if they get completely blown out of a bed, maybe you walk through there and kick them all out of there, they'll be back in there probably within a few days. They may even use that same bed that evening. Where a buck, he may take 2 to 3 weeks, or he may never visit that bed again. And weather can really dictate these bedding locations. So we have this concept of thermals, and so these thermals are essentially rising columns of warm air. So we all know the adage that warm air rises. That can also pull scent molecules. And so bucks specifically will utilize some of these areas where they can get adjacent to a slope and have those thermals pull up kind of scent columns to them. But they will also use kind of thermal bedding areas just to get out of any cold weather. If it's snowy, if it's rainy, you may find them in more areas that have more evergreens. You may find them in a cedar thicket that really gets good coverage over top of them so they can kind of stay dry. So you can kind of have a couple different instances where weather can really dictate these bedding locations. It can be thermal, and it can also be just kind of weather, like we're going to kind of move on to the next one. And solar, and this is where I think this is one of the easiest things to pinpoint as a deer hunter, is these solar bedding areas. And we have a couple examples that we'll move into after I kind of introduce it. But very commonly, you will find deer using the south side of a slope. We've all heard of the company North Face. They got their company name because, again, the north sides of slopes are often colder. They don't get as much sunlight. They often get harsher weather. And so oftentimes, if it's a very frigid day, if it's a very cold and windy and wet day, you may find a lot of activity on kind of these solar areas on the south side of the slope, just because they get a little bit more sun, so they're generally warmer. And it also can impact the vegetation that's naturally there. You'll see a lot more diversity in plants and other trees on the south side of slopes than you will on the north side. And so kind of pay attention to that as well. That can really impact how these deer are feeding and kind of using these areas. All right, and I kind of showed this example a little bit ago, but I just wanted to reiterate how important topography itself, so what the landscape looks like, are there ridges, are there valleys, all of these things can really significantly impact where a deer moves and where a deer beds. The topography is obviously going to impact where they want to walk. They're fairly lazy, kind of like us. We like to take the path of least resistance. Deer kind of fall in a similar mindset. But topography can also impact solar radiation, just kind of like we talked about with that south side of slope. But what it really benefits is it can give an increased visibility for deer. And especially as we kind of move into a few different examples of ridge point bedding, you'll commonly see bucks utilizing some of these areas where they can get up and elevated and get a really good look out over a vast area, because it gives them a little bit more protection than just utilizing their nose and their hearing as kind of that predator detection. All right, so this is some of the common buck bedding locations that we're really going to kind of dissect and dive into. I kind of briefly mentioned south facing and north face bedding, but we're going to talk what those look like on a map in a little bit. Leeward bedding is one of my favorites, right alongside ridge point bedding. Ridge point bedding is an idea I first saw mentioned. I'm blanking on the guy's name. He's a writer for Realtree magazine about a decade ago. I think his first name is Dan, but he kind of, I don't know if he came up with this idea, but he really pushed it and kind of made it fairly common in the hunting community. And it's definitely very productive, as well as oxbow bedding and then established sanctuary. So we'll kind of dissect each of these, show a few examples on a map and how to pinpoint, and then maybe how to hunt a deer that's kind of bedding in these locations. All right, so south facing slope bedding. So this is again kind of, I mentioned this a little bit during kind of solar bedding. That south side of a slope is going to be oftentimes warmer. It gets a lot more solar radiation. And if you can look at these contour lines as they kind of snake kind of along this, so you can see that that timber line really has kind of a nice ridge that just follows right along top. And so on the south side of that, you're going to have a significant slope for one, but it gives really good protection for any deer that wants to get out of the wind. But also, if you can kind of look at this big open bottom field that would be, on the south side of that slope, that's going to give them really good visibility as they can bed alongside that slope and basically just keep a nice watch out over everything that's essentially in front of them. And what's interesting is when I first kind of really started to try to identify where deer are bedding, particularly when they're bedding in the woods, it gets a little bit more difficult. When I came into examples like this, I personally, when I first got into it, I was like, oh, I would expect them to be bedded at the very top, right? But very commonly, they're about 2/3 up that slope, and they'll kind of be sitting right alongside it. Ideally, they like to use a south facing slope if they can get some kind of wind coming over the back. So a lot of times you'll see them essentially face with the wind. So they don't want to look into the wind. They want to let that scent come over behind them so they can be now watching out what's in front of me. Have anything that's coming behind them is now protected because they can smell anything coming up because the dominant wind is coming from behind them. And so now they've really got the best of both worlds. They can visually see anything that's coming in front, they can smell anything coming from behind. And so it's a really productive area for them because they can feel very safe and very secure. I will say deer are hard to hunt when they're utilizing a slope like this, particularly if you want to get in and hunt over a bedding area. I tend to shy away from hunting the actual bedding area as if it was kind of a food source. Some people try to get right on top of it. Historically, I only hunt public land. And what I have found, especially with deer on public land, they're fairly pressured as the season progresses. More and more times they're kicked out of the bed, they're disturbed at night, and that starts to change their behavior a little bit. And so I try to stay a little bit further from the bed rather than get very aggressive and get close to it, just because I don't want to pressure those deer anymore. Because then, let's say I identified this as a really productive bedding area. Maybe there's a really nice mature buck in here, or maybe there's, a family of 8 or 10 does that are utilizing it. Well, I already have that information, but if I now go in and get very aggressive and bump those deer out of there, now I'm kind of back to square one. So I like to try to stay a little bit outside of the bedding area. I don't like to be too aggressive. In an area like this, it's common for those deer to basically, when they get up, a lot of times they're just going to follow right alongside that slope. They may go up top on the ridge just to kind of peek over, but commonly they're just going to kind of follow right along the mosaic of that ridge and kind of take that path of least resistance. And now on the flip side, obviously you've got north facing slopes. So these are very productive if you have an unusually kind of warm spell come through. We always have a weekend or two in October that you may get, high 80s. I know last year opening day was, fairly warm. Even gun season last year was fairly warm, but it looks like this year, October 1st is going to be, fairly decent weather, but we may get one more, spell of some warm weather. And especially if it happens, in October or November, these deer are already starting to develop their winter coats. And so they will oftentimes try to get on the north side of that slope to get out of the sun, to get out of those, high concentrations of solar radiation like you get on the south slopes, and try to stay cool. So you can kind of use that on the flip side. If it's very warm, you may want to check on the north side. If it's very cold, you may want to check on the south side. Now, this is one of my favorite. I find this to be fairly easy to kind of identify, but also fairly easy to hunt, especially in an area like kind of this example we have pulled up here. But first, I want to talk a little bit more about these kind of rising columns of warm air, or what we call thermals. I kind of mentioned them a little bit, but they are, ever since I really started paying attention to these thermals and how it can really influence what your scent is doing out there, it's night and day. And if you don't believe me that this happens, go out to your tree stand, let the sun warm up the surface of the earth for an hour. Take a milkweed little seed, one of those things that are really lightweight and can just fly, and just let it go, and you'll see it just start to eventually, the dominant wind will kind of take it. It'll eventually hit a thermal, and it'll just shoot straight up. And you can see different vultures and different birds using these thermals when they're up there soaring. 9 times out of 10, they're in an area where there's kind of a big active thermal. But the concept for hunters, I think, is really important, especially if you're looking at bedding locations, because as they are on the side of a slope, they can basically smell anything that's below them, anything that's in the bottomland, anything that's, topographically lower than they are, because those thermals are pulling those scent molecules up the side of that slope and pulling them to the deer. And you may kind of hear a kind of an old hunter's adage to hunt the ridges in the morning and hunt the bottoms in the evening. And I don't necessarily tend to follow that, but I think it helps kind of visualize what's happening with your scent. So if you're hunting the ridges in the morning, your scent is just going up into the ether and just going away. Where in the evening, the reverse happens. That cool air starts to sink and start to pull your scent down into these bottomlands. And so if you're on the top of a slope, well, now it's just kind of basically raining all your scent all the way down that slope, all the way down that bottom, and you're just really kind of, for lack of a better term, contaminating that area with your scent. Deer will utilize this knowledge to pinpoint a bedding location. And so this is one of my favorite examples, is leeward bedding. And so it's essentially what the term leeward means is just basically against, on the other side of the wind, or out of the wind. And so in this case, you can see where that contour line is that says 650 right above the X. Jason, if you can kind of move your cursor over that. That will be essentially the top of the ridge. And so we have the wind coming from the north, and that deer is going to bed about 2/3 down on the opposite side of that slope. And so he's kind of protected from the wind. He's on the leeward side of that ridge. He's got these thermals pulling scent up. He's basically watching whichever direction he wants to, and he's very secure in a location like this. And what often happens is it essentially creates kind of this wind tunnel effect that just pulls scent from all around this deer. And so they feel very, very, very protected in an area like this. I have found lots of mature bucks will utilize a bedding location like this. And again, they don't really get big and mature by being stupid, so it certainly works to some extent. But this is a great example, and one you can easily really start to identify. Pay attention to what that wind direction is doing. Try to find some slopes in areas that you think there's some deer activity. Chances are there's probably going to be something bedding there.
Hold on, I want to make a point, but just as I was about ready to go on mute, car door shut. Okay. So also not just bedding, Dan, but also movement as well, and moving across the landscape. And they want to be able to smell where they're going too. So in the mornings when the winds, if there's no wind out, but there's always going to be thermals every day. There won't be wind every day, but there will be thermals. So they'll walk across the tops and see this if you're out hunting, and see if you notice this happening. But in the morning, they might be more pertinent to walk across the top where they can smell stuff. And then in the evening, you might see them walk along the lower part where they can smell stuff as well.
Yep. And then especially as you kind of get closer to rut, because they'll be,
well, I was about to say,
during they'll be kind of utilizing these same tactics to try to smell those that are in estrus.
Yep.
It's quite fascinating.
Yeah, so see if you see that. I've definitely saw that last year. I hunted along a ridge similar to this. It might have been even more north of the property that this is a picture of. And I definitely remember seeing deer in the evening As it was past shooting hours, it was getting dark out, and I didn't see a deer all day, but I saw
Yeah.
silhouettes moving across the thicket in the bottoms, right in the evening time. That's where they're moving through. So something to keep an eye on.
Now, this is my all-time go-to strategy. If I ever get to a new property, one of the first things I do when I pull up a topographic map is I try to identify these areas where you might have what we consider ridge point bedding. And so again, we're kind of looking at these contour lines. So that dark line that says 650 is, for lack of a better term here, that's kind of the top of that ridge. And you can really see how it kind of creates this little oxbow type eddy that kind of, projects out inside of that valley. And so you can see we have the Gimlet Branch Creek. So it's a pretty significant slope down. Again, the closer those contour lines are together, the steeper that slope is. And so it's a fairly steep slope. And a buck is commonly you're going to find bucks utilizing a ridge point setup like this more so than a doe would. They will certainly do it, but I have more common than not when I walk across a ridge point looking for beds, it's commonly if I kick up a deer, it's going to be a buck. But in this specific example, we can see we have this kind of peninsula of the ridge that kind of fingers out and jets out over top that valley. And so when a buck especially utilizes this bedding site, he is only going to do it if the wind is in the ideal condition. If it's not, chances are he'll go to a leeward bed, he'll go to a ridge, or maybe he'll just go to a bottomland and kind of tuck under a tree somewhere. But if the wind is right, which means again coming down that ridge, and so if you kind of picture a deer on top of that finger looking out, so he wants to look out over the valley, over the expanse that's kind of below him. So in this case, he's looking over the Gimlet Branch. That wind is pulling up everything from behind him. So now he's got this awesome effect of, okay, I have everything visually covered in front of me. Nothing can come up this way without me seeing it. Nothing can sneak up behind me without me smelling it. But again, he has those thermals. So he has that rising column of air that's also pulling up anything from that bottom and pulling it up the slope to him. So now he can visually see what's in front. He can smell what's in front, and he can smell what's behind. And so it's a really common strategy for bucks, especially as I don't want to say as they get pressured, but as the season progresses, I more commonly see them utilizing a setup like this than some of the other examples. But this is by far one of my first strategies when I identify a new property that I'm going to hunt. I'm always looking for these different ridge points. And if you look throughout this map, there's actually a couple different ones on here. If you want to move to the next slide, Jason, I think we have another example.
Sure. And before we do, I just wanted to point out one thing. I've actually hunted this exact section before. And one thing I tried to utilize was trying to find a spot where I could get like a bottleneck effect using this ridge line. And underneath this E is, you can see this field that's up on top of this ridge. And I figured that they'd want to stay in the cover. So this point right here even comes a little bit closer to the field than that. So there's a very narrow spot between this valley and the field. So I figured that this was almost like a little bottleneck right here of the timber that they would be flat enough for them to walk across. And sure enough, I definitely saw some deer movement through here before. So you can use these as like as a barrier as well to try to get a spot where you're going to be close to the animals as they walk through.
Certainly. And on this next ridge point that you'll pull up, it's basically the same image, just kind of moved over to another ridge point.
Oh, there you go.
I shot a buck here on that exact ridge in, I think, 2000. It was the year right before COVID, whatever year that was, 29. I don't know. They all mushed together now. But I kind of knew Jason and I, we hunt together. We talk about things. We had another buddy who hunted this exact area. And if you think back to that conversation we brought up about doe bedding, this is a pretty good example of what a doe bedding area would look like. If you look at this kind of field that, again, excuse me, it looks like a field, but it's one of these that it looks like the forest is starting to reclaim it. You're starting to see more shrubs. You're starting to see more, oak saplings start to retake over that field. Does just go crazy bedding in an area like that. I will say 9 times out of 10, when you have a field like that, especially in Illinois, it can be quite difficult to hunt, especially if there's no mature trees around it, because you're going to have tall vegetation. But knowing that, I was able to pinpoint, okay, I know where the does are bedding. I have an idea of where a buck is going to bed on one of these two ridges, and it turned out that's exactly what he did. And what he did was every morning he would follow right along top of that ridge, and he would basically go down kind of around, go up that other ridge point that we just kind of highlighted, and just follow that ridge right along. And he would be able to scent check that entire doe field to see if there's any does in heat. And they'll start that in kind of mid October. They'll real especially the younger bucks as you get closer to Halloween. That's when it really ramps up. But that's kind of what we're talking about here, is putting a lot of these pieces together, is identifying where a buck bed is, where a doe bed is. Again, if you're really focused on harvesting a buck, that's obviously what you're going to try to do. But if you're just trying to harvest a doe, in this case we have this doe bedding field. Now all we have to do is try to find out where they're feeding, and boom, now we have kind of that perfect bed to feed pattern that we kind of highlighted to start with. But you can see this example obviously has a different wind direction. And so you can see a buck very commonly will have up to a dozen or so different bedding sites. And again, a lot of it will dictate, what time of year it is, if it's rut, whatever, but really what the weather is doing and what that dominant wind direction is doing. That is crucial to every hunt. And one thing I am a big proponent of, and again, every hunter's got their own way of doing things. Jason, feel free to chime in if you disagree here, but I will have about 7 or 8 different what I call stand locations on a piece of public land that I can choose to go to depending on wind direction. And there's been times where I will have pictures of a buck just every night, every day at the exact same time. I know I can get in there and I can get on him, but the wind direction's incorrect. I will not take the opportunity to go out. I will go to a different stand, forego, even if I know he's using it. If I think there's a chance that my wind is going to disturb him, I'm going to try to avoid it at all costs. So don't be afraid that if the wind is incorrect for your location, to either pack up and try a different place, or kind of just skip the day's hunt. It can certainly be advantageous in the long run, because again, if you really disturb those deer and really spook them out of there, you pretty much lost everything you've built to that point. You've identified the bed, you've identified the feed, you've identified a travel route. Well, now you're going to have to start from scratch.
Yeah, no, that is 100% the correct way to go about being a disciplined hunter, and being able to stop yourself from being too aggressive and moving in an area that the wind's not right that day.
And it's hard. I'll say that it's hard.
Oh, it's so hard, especially if you have a schedule where you only get like a day a week to get
Right.
out, depending on
Yep.
what you got going on. It's so hard to look at the weather schedule and be like, oh, great, my spot, I can't even go out there today, and I won't be able to
Exactly.
get out for another 2 weeks. So try to find multiple spots that are good in any direction, and that way you won't be in that situation for sure. Plan ahead, knowing that.
Yep. I always have one spot for every kind of cardinal direction. So
Yeah.
north, south, east, west, that I can hunt with a north wind, a south wind. So I always at least have one option, no matter what that wind's doing. It might not
Yep.
be my most productive stand, but at least an option to hunt.
And also, know all the different types. We're going to get into it here in a second, but know all the different types of feeding areas that there can be. Just because there's ag fields down here doesn't mean that these does that are in this CRP field are going down this ag field. This whole flat up here is a bunch of oaks. So depending on what time of year it is, there's a lot of acorns up here. So they could just be going back and forth. And I mean, the closer the food sources to the bedding area, the happier the deer are, because again, it comes down to just safety and laziness. So
Yeah.
it's a little bit of both. So keep that in mind.
And it looks like we'll have a decent acorn crop this year. I've been kind of, paying attention to the trees around my neighborhood and done a little bit of scouting, and the squirrels are certainly happy, and it seems like there's quite an abundance of acorns on the ground already, but we'll see. So this is kind of another example of what I will commonly, when I first look at a map, these are the things I'm focusing on. Where is there ridge point bedding? Is there really steep slopes? And is there an oxbow like this? This is a very, very, very common bed for the mature bucks. This is about as safe and secure as a bed as that you can really get, especially in Illinois, since we don't have a lot of topography. Especially we're in central Illinois, we have virtually zero. But an oxbow can provide a lot of cover. And so an oxbow is essentially just a bend in a river that almost creates a bowl shape. And you can almost see that it would create an island if the river would just kind of cut right through it and cut it off. But what a buck can really do is he can get in there, and again, pay attention to the wind direction in this example. He won't use this bed if the wind is coming from the east. It needs to be a westerly wind because, again, just like in the ridge point, he's going to sit on that oxbow. Chances are he's going to be facing out in the river or in the creek, whatever that body of water is, and he can smell anything coming up behind him. He can smell anything, he can hear anything, because wind has a unique tendency to really carry sounds as well. And so anything trying to sneak up through there, he's gonna be able to pick it off pretty quick. They will have a few different escape routes through an area like this, but the nice thing is he will just go right in the water if he needs to. And so that's kind of his big escape route. He can just jump right in the creek, cross it, and he can go about his way. Now, I would kind of caution, depending on the piece of public land you're hunting, if it's a waterway that gets a lot of kayak or canoe traffic, may not be the best example of an oxbow bed, but you can also use that to your advantage. So in an area like this, you could almost kayak or canoe in there and really put up a pretty decent setup if you can pinpoint that buck goes to feed in the morning and he leaves that oxbow. Commonly when they leave the oxbow, if he's not, disturbed and not kicked out of his bed, he will just kind of walk right down the middle of it. And in this case, he would probably curl off to the left and kind of head south a little bit and just follow the natural contour of that river. So if you can pinpoint that he's not utilizing that bed at a certain time, you can try to sneak in there, get set up. And again, in an area like this, as he reapproaches that bed, chances are he's going to follow right along it. And if that wind is blowing the way this example is, he's not going to smell you at all. And so that can be a really good strategy. Again, it can be quite aggressive. It can be quite tedious, but it's also adventurous. Not many people will take the effort to bring in a kayak or a canoe to get in your deer spot, but oftentimes little things like that, especially on public land, can put you in one of these, what I consider an established sanctuary, because it would be very hard to hunt this example without doing that, unless you could really pinpoint where that buck is walking so that you can kind of avoid that as you try to sneak in while he's out feeding. But it can certainly be done, but going by water is certainly a really good option. Yeah, I just said all that. All right, so now we're going to get into feeding a little bit, and then we'll kind of go back and show a few more examples of bedding to feeding. But what I really want to highlight here is acorns are kind of the staple food source for deer during the fall, during hunting season. Now, obviously, right now, and it kind of depends on what part of the state you're in. We're here in East Central Illinois, so we had some pretty severe drought conditions throughout the growing season. So a lot of our corn and soybean has already been cut for silage. I saw some people out harvesting already this past week. As those crops start to come out of the ground, you're going to start to see the deer shift their behavior, especially their feeding behavior. They're going to move. A deer can essentially spend its entire life in a cornfield during the growing season. It's got food, it's got cover, and it's got water. Now, it may not have standing water, but the interesting thing about deer is they don't oftentimes need, a puddle of water. They are pretty good at being able to get moisture through consumption, whether it's the morning dew on different vegetation that they're eating or just from the moisture content of the food that they're eating. And so we'll see kind of this, what I call it kind of the great migration back to the woods. Once those crops really start to come out of the ground, that's personally when I start getting really serious about deer hunting, because that's when you start to see a lot of the deer push back into their normal habitats where they're, in my opinion, a little bit more huntable. And oftentimes that times out pretty well with the big acorn drop. And so acorns, again, are their primary food source. If you're unfamiliar with acorn, it comes from oak trees, and it's very cyclical. You don't have this kind of, I don't want to say average growth every year. It's very cyclical. A lot of it depends on moisture content, on rain, and different weather factors. But what's interesting is deer will actually shift their ranges to utilize different species of oak trees throughout the season. As different trees drop acorns at different times, you will start to see a natural shift. And if you can start to pinpoint different oak trees and when they produce acorns, night and day, it will change the way you hunt. And we'll kind of get into that here on the next slide a little bit, because I think I talked a little bit about my kind of bedding strategy, but looking at species composition of oaks and how deer utilize them has changed everything I know about deer hunting for the better. It's made me a lot more productive. I see a lot more deer from the stand. I'm able to get a lot closer to deer. I see more and more often. It's very, very productive. All right, so we kind of have two types of oaks. Obviously, there's a plethora of species. I think there's probably 100 different species of oaks just in the Midwest, really. But I'm going to kind of boil it down to two different groups. And so oaks can be classified in what we call subfamilies. So we have the red oaks and we have the white oaks. And so that's kind of what we're going to talk about here. I don't care what the actual species of that tree is as a hunter. What I really care about is it a red oak or a white oak? Now, white oaks are going to be the preferred acorn for most wildlife. They have a lower tannic acid content, so they're essentially not as bitter. They have a sweeter flavor, and they're a lot more nutritious. So they're often the preferred food source for squirrels, for turkey, for some waterfowl species, as well as deer and an abundance of different wildlife. But the interesting thing is red oaks will still be consumed. They're a little bit more bitter because they have that higher tannic acid content, but they're still fairly viable and fairly nutritious. And the big distinction between the two is the amount of time that it takes for that acorn to mature. So a white oak, it will take one growing season for an individual acorn to mature. On a red oak, it takes two years or two growing seasons, so two springs, for that acorn to produce. So that's really interesting because if you think about years in drought, well, you might have a reduced white oak acorn crop just because they didn't get that necessary water. Where the red oak, it still had, a full year of producing viable acorns, and so it can tolerate drought conditions a little bit more. Now, I should say that red oaks are still going to drop acorns every year. It's just it takes an individual acorn 2 years to mature on the tree. And what's also interesting is the red oaks have a lot more viability when they hit the ground. And a lot of this is due to that higher tannic acid content. So it allows them to not rot as fast or not germinate as fast. So they tend to stay around on the ground, being viable and still being edible a lot longer than the white oaks. So the white oaks are preferred. The red oaks last longer and are a little bit more reliable based on that kind of 2 year acorn maturation.
My rule of thumb for this one is white-tailed deer like white oak acorns.
I
So
like
it's
it.
there you go.
I like it. And now you may ask yourself, well, okay, that's great. How do I tell the difference? And there's a really, really, really simple way. It can be quite complex looking at the individual acorn. So what I recommend is looking at the leaves. And what's really common with oaks is they have what we call hardy leaves. And so they're very commonly, even during the dead of fall as we approach winter, there's still going to be some kind of brown dead leaves that are still hanging on that tree. And if you can see, there's a pretty big difference between these two. Now, not every oak leaf looks like this, but if you can pinpoint the difference between a red oak and a white oak, which here, if we look where we have the arrow pointing, this is a textbook example of a red oak leaf. You can see it's got these bristle tips that kind of come to almost like a little hair-like projection on the tip of those lobes, where on the white oak, we have a lot more of this kind of rounded shape. It doesn't have those bristle tips, but also these kind of more rounded lobes rather than the red oak. And so the white oak, again, like Jason said, white oak, white-tailed deer, rounded lobes. You can probably come up with some kind of little acronym or something to kind of help you remember that. But being able to walk into an area and say, okay, this area is dominated by red oaks, or this area is dominated by white oaks, I tend to start my season more in white oak areas. As I start to see deer, you'll naturally see, okay, there's a ton of deer feeding on these acorns commonly. If you have a trail camera, they'll be in there all night eating all the acorns, and then all of a sudden, like that, they'll just be gone. You're like, did I spook them? Did I mess something up? Chances are there's just not a lot of food left, and so they kind of shifted to a different area. And so it's interesting to start putting some of these pieces together. When I walk into a new piece of property, a new, whatever I'm scouting, that's what I'm looking at. I'm not necessarily looking for deer tracks. Obviously, I still am to some extent, but what I'm really focused on is what are the trees, what is the terrain, and how can I visually see deer moving through this area. And once you start to put those together in conjunction with being able to identify between a red oak and a white oak, it can really bolster your hunting success. Now, We know scent is extremely important, especially for white-tailed deer. So we're going to talk a little bit about kind of scent control. We'll kind of just touch on it here a little bit, not going to spend too much time on it. And then we're really going to get into my favorite part of the presentation, which is what I call my seasonal hunting approach. So I have different stand sites for, different times of year, depending on what the deer are doing. But what's always in the back of my head is, what is that wind direction doing? What are the thermals doing? I know I've been guilty of this. There's a million different hunting products out there, whether it's shampoo, I saw a product growing up, my dad got me for Christmas one year called Gummaflage. That's supposed to be a piece of chewing gum that makes your breath smell like dirt so you don't, blow out scent molecules. There's, ozone generators that can destroy your scent. If you can just play the wind direction right, that is the most important thing. If you can play that wind direction and kind of keep the concept of thermals in your mind a little bit, you can do away with a lot of those different products. Now, I certainly still don't, spray Febreze or wear cologne when I'm out hunting, and I still try to keep any scent to a minimum. And so when I'm storing my camo, I store it all in big plastic totes that are, kind of sealed up, and I oftentimes will clip a cedar branch and just throw it in there. It gives a little bit of cover scent. But again, it just kind of keeps them away from the smells of the dogs and other things that are at your house, because that's what really can influence a deer hunt more than anything is your scent. If you're in a stand and you're just not seeing deer time after time after time, chances are the wind may not be correct, and it's not always where you think deer will be. Obviously, one of the big adages for deer hunting is you want the wind in your face. And 9 times out of 10, that's correct, because the way you're facing, you anticipate the deer being in front of you. So you kind of want the wind blowing from the deer to you. But oftentimes, it's also, where are they coming from? Where are they going? That all is part of the puzzle. If you just focus on your scent from the trail, but you're not worried about how you're getting to your stand, or where the deer are coming from, or where the deer are bedding, or where they're going to, that can really impact things. And so just pay really close attention to that wind direction, but also try to minimize your scent contamination as much as possible. And if you want to use those products, go right ahead. I certainly, I still use some of the scent killer spray. I'll use some of the laundry detergent, but you don't have to go, certainly crazy with it. If you play the wind right, you'll be in a good spot. All right, so now we'll get into my favorite part. You can go ahead and move on to the next slide, Jason. This is what I call my kind of seasonal approach. And so we're just going to take a step by step, kind of looking at the weeks through hunting season. So we're going to focus really on archery. So from October 1st to mid-January, and we're going to go through some different strategies that you can kind of utilize, and some different examples kind of in each of these time frames. Because one of my biggest gripes with a lot of the hunting shows or hunting related content, they really focus a lot of times on that 2 week window of rut. And sure, I mean, everybody loves hunting rut and pre-rut. That's when things are exciting. That's when deer just, all their inhibitions go out the window, and they're just kind of out there to breed. And so they let their guard down a little bit. A lot of us don't have the luxury of being able to just really hunt that one window and trying to harvest the deer. And so I really like to focus on what we can do outside of all those, and still during rut, but what can we do outside of those times to really bolster our success? And a lot of it, again, is focusing on these breeding behaviors, but also focusing on deer behavior. And so we'll kind of first start out here in early October, which, hey, we're just a few short days away before the start of the season. I will be focusing very heavily on feeding and high traffic areas. And again, that may sound fairly intuitive, but what I really want to focus on is ag crops, especially if ag crops are still standing. And it does not matter if the ag crops are on the specific piece of property that you're hunting. If they're a half mile to, a mile, they may still be using those areas. If it's just the adjacent property, they're probably still going to be using those. And so that's where I'm going to really focus my scouting efforts, is trying to identify how they're getting to those ag areas and how they're coming back to where I can hunt them. And so a lot of times, I personally don't do a ton of scouting in August and through kind of mid-September. I really like to start in kind of mid-September. And this is one of my biggest pitches as a hunter. scout during the season. Things are always changing. If you're just relying on what you learned in July and August and September, and you're in November or December, things are going to drastically change on the landscape, and it's probably going to really reduce your chances of success. And so, really consistent scouting, and especially being able to identify these kind of high traffic areas where they're going from a bed to an ag field, can be very productive. And trail cameras, whether you love them or you hate them, they can be extremely productive at kind of watching over these areas and letting you know when deer are moving through an area, because that's also important. If they're only traveling this area at 2 a.m., doesn't really do you much good. That's out of, it's pitch black, it's out of legal shooting hours. So I also like to run trail cameras, especially early October, so I can see what time of day they're kind of utilizing these areas.
Yeah, just if you're new at this, and you put out a trail camera and you see a big buck one time, don't waste too much time chasing after it, even if it is during the daytime, because they move quite large distances and he may never come past that tree again. So, it's fun to see, and hey, if you get one that's coming back regularly, that's awesome. But don't waste your whole season chasing something that was only there one time.
I tell you what, the 3 bucks I have here on the wall, I ran trail cameras pretty heavily on the piece of public land that I got all these three on. I don't have a single picture of any of them. And they were what I consider just new bucks who came through an area as rut was starting to pick up. We got towards late October. That's when bucks will just drastically change their range. So don't just rely on trail cameras to tell you exactly what's out there. Like Jason said, you may get just one picture of a random deer as he's just checking out a new area.
Yep.
But here's again, I want to pull up this example because this is one of the best examples I think, is highlighting these funnels between a doe, or just not even doe, just between a bedding area and a feeding area. Finding these areas that funnel traffic, whether it's and it could be another example where it's just a hedgerow or a fence line. Deer oftentimes don't like to just run, straight through a field or walk right across a field. They like to follow, again, like we talked about in the beginning, that edge, that intersection between, two habitat types. And oftentimes they will just follow right along that edge as kind of a natural corridor, and it can really funnel all that activity. Because especially with archery, obviously with modern archery, everybody's got their own kind of ethical range they'll be able to shoot effectively to make sure we get that quick humane harvest. But we're oftentimes trying to get within 30-35 yards of that deer, and anything we can do to pinpoint where they're kind of funneling together can really put us in a good position. And so these can be terrain, like we kind of talked about in this example. It can be structures, it can be water, it can be kind of a variety of different things that all kind of act as these funnels that just basically push deer to walk in a certain area. Oh, this is a good one. So if you've been around the hunting community for a while, I had never heard this term until probably a few years ago. I think I was watching Midwest Whitetail. They used to have a weekly show where they just kind of, shared what they were seeing out in the woods, and wrote a blog about it and had this big YouTube channel. But they introduced me to this term October lull, and I never really thought of it that way. And I think a lot of it is just due to the style of hunting that I do. But what's very common for a lot of public land hunters is this kind of mid-October period where activity decreases. And it really doesn't decrease, but what it does is obviously deer have had kind of the run of the place for, July, August, September. No pressure, they've been careless. They can just do whatever they want. They don't get jumped out of their beds at 2 a.m. Well, now things are starting to change. They've been pressured for a couple weeks now. They've been bumped out of their beds. They've probably run into hunters. They've probably been shot at or shot. And so it can really impact what they're doing. And oftentimes, what you'll see is not necessarily a reduced activity, but that activity gets a little bit delayed. And so a lot of times, let's say you were watching a trail and at 4:30 p.m., that's when the does were kind of moving along that trail. It may be a little bit closer to 5:30 or 6, depending on, obviously time changes and all that. That's just an example. that it may just kind of delay their activity a little bit so that they can use that cover of darkness. And oftentimes, what you'll find is they're still moving, but they're in an area like this, what we call a staging area. And so, this is an area that's kind of adjacent to a food source where they can just sit there and watch. And you may have a buck or a doe or even a family of does who will sit in the staging area. I've had it at, I think it was at, I forget which piece of public land it was at, but it was last year. It was a similar kind of setup to this. And I saw a doe just pop her head out. I was like, okay, okay, she's coming. And she literally sat there for 45 minutes, not moving, just with her head just out of the timber and just watched that entire field. She just wanted to really monitor it and to make sure it was completely safe before they decided to go out and feed. And so she let it get really close to dark before all those does really started to push into that food source. And so what's common is, again, to be in these staging areas. And so it's not necessarily that you're seeing a reduced activity. There is some of that to some extent, but a lot of it is just kind of delaying this. So let's say you're hunting from a bed to food, right? These are kind of your examples. And maybe before you were smack dab in the middle between your bedding site and your feeding location. During the October lull, that kind of people term it, that mid-October period, I may shift a little bit closer to the bed so that I ensure that when they kind of travel through the area that I think they're going to, it's still within legal shooting light. Because I think that's what a lot of hunters run into is they're still relying on kind of that early season pattern, and especially on public land, it's going to kind of delay things and kind of slow things down a little bit. They're going to like to use that cover of darkness. And so I may get a little bit closer to the bedding area just to give myself a better chance of having them walk by while it's still within legal shooting light. And this is when things get very, very, very fun. So we're often asked, everybody says, oh, November 7th is the great. I see your question, Jamie. I will answer that in just a second. So everybody always asks, what's if you had one day to hunt, what would it be? Personally, every day of the year, great day to hunt. But if I had to only hunt one single day, especially for deer, it's going to be Halloween. Halloween, Halloween, Halloween. That's when I find deer and especially bucks really start to ramp up their activity. That's when the testosterone is not quite peaking in the bucks, but it's really starting to become elevated, and so it's starting to force them to really focus on breeding. Now, in kind of mid October, you'll start to see some of the younger bucks. Like I took this picture here a few years back, and that was kind of mid October. This little, probably year and a half old buck was out there harassing does. Oh, I'm ready to breed. I'm ready, and they of course weren't ready yet. He wasn't ready yet. He just doesn't really know what those kind of changes in his body are happening. He's going through essentially puberty for the first time. So you'll see a little bit of increased activity through mid-October, especially for younger bucks. But as you get closer and closer to the end of October, or my favorite day, Halloween, that's when you really start to see the mature bucks really start to cruise. And this is what most people call as kind of the seeking phase of rut, or what most people call pre-rut. So rut isn't really here yet. Rut is kind of that breeding period. We're in this kind of seeking phase where bucks are going to start expanding their home range. You may have identified a buck in an area. Okay, he's got a bed here, he's got food here. He didn't really travel but a couple hundred yards throughout October. Well, now as November approaches, he's going to drastically increase that range. He's going to start covering a lot of ground, and he's going to try to find essentially that first doe that's in heat. And so if you're hunting for bucks, it can be really effective to focus on rubs or scrapes, which we have a few pictures of, and I'll kind of discuss those in a little bit. But again, I'm still focused on kind of that transition between bed and food. And I think a lot of buck hunters, or people who, focus on harvesting a buck, especially during a rut, really do themselves a disservice by kind of forgetting that basic concept of bed to feed. Because oftentimes when I'm, what people would term in a rut stand, I'm in a normal stand where I expect does to walk by me. The bucks, especially this time of year, they're going to want to be where the does are. And so that's kind of where you want to be set up at. And so this is kind of a quick just illustration of the difference between a scrape and a rub. So a scrape is going to be on the ground. You can kind of see this picture here. It essentially is a bare spot of vegetation where a deer is out there, scraping all that vegetation around. And essentially what he's doing is using this as kind of a communication tool. And they kind of use it the same way they use a rub. So a rub is another way that deer can communicate with other deer. But it also acts as a great sign for us as hunters. They're pretty easy to identify and they're pretty easy to find. And so if you're interested in hunting over rubs, I'll kind of describe the role that a rub can play in terms of a communication strategy. What they're really doing is using it as scent dispersal. And so at the base, let me grab this deer here. At the base of a deer's antlers, essentially right here, he's going to have scent glands. And these scent glands, as he's rubbing on that tree, are going to deposit scent along that tree. And so he's kind of using that as his communication tool to kind of mark his territory. But oftentimes, you're going to see a buck, especially if he's starting to get older, he will hit the same trees year after year after year and start really marking out that territory. But what I really want to highlight is when you're out walking and you find a rub, spin around spin around in 360 degrees and just kind of look out. Chances are you're going to see another one. Go to that one, do the same thing, and another one. And oftentimes they'll create kind of what this bottom illustration here is showing, a rub line. And commonly a buck will go visit that rub line a couple times a week. He'll kind of freshen it up, add a little bit more scent. Very commonly, unfortunately, they're doing a lot of this activity during dark hours when it's not necessarily, in legal shooting light. And having a trail camera on an area like this can help you highlight whether that specific buck is using this rub line during legal shooting light or if it's all happening at night. But it can be a great indication that you're kind of in that buck's, what I consider that buck's bedroom. What I like to focus a little bit more on, especially if I'm trying to hunt buck sign, is these scrapes. So this is actually what I consider. I took this picture a few years ago on a piece of public land. I kind of consider this a signpost scrape. It was probably 5 feet in diameter, so just a giant circle of area that has been completely stripped bare of all the leaf cover, all the vegetation. You can actually look in there and see those claw mark or those toe marks from the hooves of deer as they're kind of scraping that vegetation away. And so what they're doing, especially a buck when he makes this scrape, is on the inside of his legs he's got what we call tarsal glands. They're kind of right at his knee joint. And so after he makes the scrape, he's going to go stand in that scrape and he's going to urinate down his legs. That urine is going to cross over those tarsal glands as it kind of drips down, picking up those pheromones that those glands are reducing or producing, and then deposit that on the ground. And so he's using this as kind of a communication tool through these pheromones and through scent to communicate with different deer. Now he can communicate with different bucks because it can say, "Hey, I'm a mature buck. I'm already in this area." Another buck may come across a younger buck. "Oh God, oh there's a big guy around. He's the mature one. This isn't my territory," and move on. But what it's more commonly used for, especially as you get towards late October and into November, is letting a doe know, "Hey, I'm here." And he's going to be constantly checking that day after day in the hopes that a doe is going to walk by the scrape, do the same thing, but she's going to be an estrus. And as he continues to check it, he will be able to, say, "Oh, a doe visited. She's in estrus. She's in heat. She's ready to breed." And then he's going to start tracking her and start chasing her until he can, finally find her down or find her. And so that's what's a really important aspect of these scrapes is obviously he wants does to walk by it, right? So he's commonly going to make these scrapes in areas that are frequently visited by does. So very commonly you'll find them along very heavily utilized doe trails. So that's a really another good kind of piece of advice is if you come across a scrape, chances are it's probably in a fairly high trafficked area. Now, again, a lot of times, especially the buck is going to be visiting these scrapes in kind of the dark hours, but still worth, investigating, still worth maybe sitting over or even hanging a trail camera on. I will say, if you come across a scrape on public land, if it's, in the middle of a field or on the edge of a field where they commonly are, chances are you're probably not the first hunter that sees it. So what I really like to find is these scrapes that are kind of interior in the forest, interior in the woods. Those I find to be a little bit more productive, and oftentimes I think you may actually get a little bit more daylight activity visiting that scrape rather than some of these, more peripheral ones that are really focused in those fields. Those very commonly only get visited at night.
Yeah, and then also the tactic of doing a scent drag too, Dan, from these areas is a good spot too. If we talked about that in Deer 102, where you can use a scent lure, so a doe and estrus, and put that on a cotton swab, and then drag that behind you with a piece of string, and then you can use that to trail a buck to your site. So they're going to be going to spots like this to check for signs. Well, you can put that scent there and have them follow it and be in an area where you can take a shot and go through one of your shooting lanes there.
Yeah, and I was actually I think it was the buck that I actually just showed you. When I harvested him, I used that exact strategy. I came across a decent sized scrape that was kind of forest interior. I was like, hey, I've never seen the scrape before. It's fairly new. Just going to give it a try. So I walked through it, dropped a couple dropped a couple drops of doe urine in it, and just kind of put a little trail going right back to my tree. And at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, which again, I think is a really important point. A lot of people really focus on that, last hour of daylight as being the most productive, which it certainly is. But during rut, I will oftentimes sit an entire day in a tree. And I know everybody can't do that, but the more time in a tree is advantageous because at 3 o'clock, here came this guy, head down, nose to the ground, following right along that doe estrus. So good point, Jason. That's a really productive strategy. Commonly on these kind of primary scrapes, you can see this deer is actually doing what we call interacting with a licking branch. And so commonly on these scrapes, you'll find a low-lying branch that's roughly 5 or so feet off the ground, and he's going to basically lick it. And he's also going to kind of move his antlers around and use that same scent gland that's at the base of his antlers that he's using for rubs. He's also going to be dispersing that scent on this method, and so he's really putting his scent everywhere. He's got it in the tree above, he's got it in the scrape below, and it can be really productive. So look out for those licking branches. And so here's kind of a pretty good scenario. This is kind of one that we illustrated a little bit going back. This is kind of that same area we highlighted the ridge point bedding. And so we have this nice example of a doe bedding area. And what is very, very, very common in late October and into early November and even through mid-November, if you're really focused on harvesting a buck, I would say this is probably your by far best bet, is getting on the downwind side of a doe bedding area. Because a buck, again, we're still in this what we consider the seeking phase. What a buck's going to do is he wants to cover as much ground as he can and scent check as many does as he can. And so commonly they will just make loops going from doe bedding area to doe bedding area, and they'll just stay on that downwind side because all they have to do is walk by it. That scent is blowing across all those doe, or that wind is blowing across all those does, so he will be able to tell if any of those does are in estrus. And so this is a very common strategy to catch, a cruising or seeking buck off guard as he's just circling that downwind side. And again, he'll hit this bedding area, he'll go to another bed, another one, and another one, and then he may loop all the way back around. Pretty wild, but a very productive kind of example here. And now as we kind of get into early November, mid-November, this is what I would consider peak rut for most times. Now I do want to just kind of highlight something about rut. A lot of people think that rut is kind of dictated by weather or by moon phases. What really triggers rut, what triggers this kind of hormonal response in the bucks and the does, is the photo period. So it's the amount of daylight in a specific day. And that's why it's very common every single year. We can basically say peak rut is going to be November 10th through November 17th. That's when the majority of does are going to be bred, is kind of during that kind of week to 2 week window. And again, it's because it's the same year after year. It's just the length of daylight that's kind of out there. So the amount of sunlight you have in a specific day. But during this kind of early November through mid-November, I'm kind of doing the same thing I'm doing in late October. I'm focusing on what the does are doing. I'm trying to focus on the downwind side of those bedding areas, but I may start to get a little bit more aggressive. And just as an example to show how, for lack of a better term, dumb these bucks get when this testosterone really starts peaking. I was hunting in Missouri a few years back, and I had a doe come running through my setup. It was actually Halloween. At about 3:30, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a doe came hauling in, and she was doing what I consider a telltale sign. She kept looking back over her shoulder. I saw those ears, kind of they look like almost satellite dishes, just the way they can kind of rotate independently. That instantly tells me that something is chasing her, and that what's common this time of year is a buck chasing a doe. And so that doe came in. She stood at about 12 yards, just constantly looking over her shoulder. And then all of a sudden, I hear what sounded like a grizzly bear just coming through the woods. And this buck just tears off after her. I'm able to get him stopped, but he's just so focused on that doe. He really never heard me. And so I draw my bow back, and unfortunately my arrow nock was not knocked all the way onto the string, and I'm in what we consider a ladder stand. So it's just kind of a metal basket stand that has ladder rungs that go down to the ground, and that arrow popped off as I was drawing back, and it hit at least 4 or 5 of those steps on the way down. And mind you, this buck is at 12 yards. While all of this is happening, I have time to turn around, grab another arrow, draw back again, aim, and take the shot. And the only reason that happened is because that buck was so essentially high on testosterone, that he was so critically focused on that doe, that he was oblivious to the entire world around him. And so I say that just to say, this time of year, literally anything can happen. I've been in tree stands where I've had 8 different bucks come harass a single doe. Chances are she was probably the first doe in the area that went into heat, and so it attracted all the bucks in the area. And so it's just really one of those what we consider kind of magical times to be in the woods. It's when deer really let their guards down. They're very active. They're very daylight active, and it can be a really good time to hunt.
Yeah, just to reiterate that, I mean, there's been bucks chasing does similar to this image that we have here, and they come running by your stand, and you make any noise that you can to make them try to stop and look up
You
at you
can't
just for
stop
a
them.
second, and you can't. You can go meh, 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 as much as you want, or just be like, hey, blah, blah, blah. And then
Yep,
they don't
yep.
run, they don't their stride does not change. They are just doing what they're doing.
And so this is when the time of year when calling can be very effective, especially kind of late October, early November. Now, I have a different philosophy on calling than a lot of other hunters. I kind of view it as there's kind of two groups. There's blind calling, so that's kind of just calling into the void, hoping something hears it and something responds. I personally don't do a lot of that. I like to be able. Again, I hunt on public land, so these deer get called at a lot. They get rattled at a lot, and rattling, if you're unfamiliar, is just basically clanging two antlers together to try to sound like two fighting deer. Um, I find it a lot more productive to be able to visually see a deer and to see how that specific deer is reacting to my calls. So if I'm sitting in an area and I see a buck that's 150 yards away, and he's just kind of skirting and he's just kind of doing his own thing, I may let out a few grunts just and see what his response is. If he does one of these where he turns his body and kind of puffs his neck up, chances are I'm going to start grabbing my bow because he's probably on his way. But there will be instances where calling may actually be a deterrent. And so I personally really, really, really like to be able to watch those deer and see what they're doing. Deer, especially bucks, especially older bucks, have a very good tendency to be able to pinpoint where a noise comes from. And the more you call, the more opportunity you're giving them to pinpoint. And deer, again, especially a mature buck, they know how to play the wind. If they can pinpoint where a sound's coming from, they want to try to get downwind of it. So they will circle around you and try to get that scent blowing to them from where they heard the call from, so that they can see, is this another buck that I expected? Is this, a mature? Is this who is that? What is this? And commonly, if you're doing that without knowing where deer are, I find it can be very disadvantageous, because all that's going to happen, you're just going to have bucks come up or deer come up from behind you. they'll smell you and you'll never even know they responded to your calls, because you won't hear them, you won't see them. Deer have a tendency to be able to walk. I swear, a squirrel sounds so much louder than a deer. A deer can sneak up 5 feet behind you and you'll never know. They are that quiet, unless they're running, of course. But 9 times out of 10, they will try to sneak downwind of you. So I like to be able to visually see that deer, see its response, before I start calling. And this is a good example of an area where I might call from. You can see I'm kind of set up in that buck's bedroom. So I have a rub line, across the field. Maybe I found some scrapes nearby. I know I'm close to that buck. Maybe I do want to try some blind calling. If I do, I like to be in an area where it's difficult for that buck to sneak up behind me. And so I may get on the leeward side of a slope, right? So that it's hard for him to smell my wind. Hopefully my wind is getting carried up by those thermals. This would be, in my case, more of a morning spot. So my thermals are kind of rising and my scent is going straight up as I'm kind of near the top of that slope. But it kind of reduces the chance that he's going to try to sneak up behind me. And so that's often when I may use a blind call, but very commonly I'm only calling when I can see that animal, I can visually see it, and see its response, because every deer is going to respond different. That deer may have had people rattle at him 50 times already, and so he's like, oh, whatever, I know that's not other deer. And so you want to try to be realistic. So I don't do a ton of calling, but when I do, it's a very targeted approach at a specific animal so that I can visually watch those cues. And you can also kind of do a similar setup with a decoy. I will caution, there are a few kind of safety things to keep in mind, but essentially what you're doing here is taking out a full life-size deer, setting it there and letting it act as a deer. So these can be productive. What I would caution people is when you're moving it, please wear some kind of blaze orange or something to make it abundantly clear that that is not a real deer in any way, shape, or form. And also don't leave it overnight. Even if you're on private land, I did this growing up. I bought a decoy just to try to see if I could see how deer were responding to it. I think I was 14 or 15 at the time, and I left it overnight. I came back the next morning and the thing was trashed and just scattered all across the field. And my assumption is another buck came to it in the night, thought it was another buck, and then started attacking it and just kind of thrashed it all over the place. So it can be very effective. But it's one of those things I don't necessarily use now, especially hunting on public land. It's a lot more gear to bring in. Oftentimes it's a lot more trouble than it's probably worth, but certainly something to think about.
So we learned leave it overnight as long as you have a camera on it to get really cool
Yeah,
footage of
yeah.
something destroying it.
I mean, I've had bucks, especially is actually that same decoy. That night, I had two different young bucks try to come up and mount the thing. So they are effective,
Wow.
but just kind of keep that in mind. Okay, so kind of sticking with this early November, again, we're still focusing on this rut behavior. Bucks are focused on one thing, breeding does. Does are focused on one thing, breeding. So again, what I'm trying to do is still get on those downwind side of bedding areas. And you can see this is kind of another example of those overgrown fields that look like the forest is kind of starting to take back over. These are very common kind of doe family bedding sites. And just kind of set on the downwind side of those. And chances are at some point, a buck will try to sneak on by. But try to get far enough away that the buck will be in front of you, because obviously you don't want the buck behind you, because then it's going to smell you as well. So commonly you'll see a fairly utilized trail going on the downwind side of that bedding area already, and just try to set 15, 20 yards outside of that, and that should give you enough leeway to still get an effective shot, kind of be inside of that effective range. Now, this is when I find hunting to be very, very, very difficult. Mid-November, so this is the peakest of peak rut. This is what I will call the tending phase. This is when the bucks are actually breeding does. They're not chasing anymore. The buck has already found himself a doe. Every buck has found a doe by this point normally. And this is the active breeding. And so if you watch Facebook or Instagram or whatever, you'll naturally see just by the level, you'll have a bunch of hunters go, "Oh my gosh, where are the deer?" You'll start to see gaps. Historically, people are posting deer harvest picture day after day after day. and then it'll just slow down. And a lot of that is because this time of year, this mid-November, they are actively breeding. And when a buck is with a doe and they're in the tending phase or the breeding phase, they will be together for about 24 to 48 hours. They'll, breed, they'll rest, they'll breed again, they'll rest, they'll breed again, they'll rest, and they'll do that for about 48 hours. And that buck will not leave that doe until he feels that he's bred her sufficiently. And so I personally don't do a ton of hunting during this tending phase. I tend to take it off. I've been hunting very hard in late October and early November, but it can still be quite productive. Just try to get in those thicker habitats or in areas that you're still kind of on the downwind side of that bedding area, because that's when you may start to see some of the younger bucks who haven't yet been able to solidify a doe. They're still going to be out cruising. They're still going to be out searching. And those younger does are still going to be doing kind of the same bed to feed pattern. Now, as we kind of move through out of November, we moved into December, there's this concept of a second rut. And I want to clarify a few things. A lot of people think that this is going to be kind of the same level of rut activity that you saw during the first rut. And unfortunately, that's not necessarily the case. Now, you will still see an increased activity, but what you're really seeing is those does who were unsuccessfully bred during the first rut. 28 days, they'll enter another estrus cycle. And so typically it's about mid-December when they'll kind of hit that peak estrus cycle. You may also have the fawns from the previous summer. Some of those early fawns will start to be in a body condition to where they can go into estrus too. And so you'll also start to see some of the about 7 to 8 month old fawns at this point. Some of those, a very smallish number, but they will also be receptive to breed, and they will kind of enter that first estrus cycle. But during this time, I'm really shifting back to the bed to feed pattern. Jamie, we have a question. Do bucks act differently if they sense the scent of a woman instead of a man? That's actually a really good question. And there actually is some research to indicate that deer can sense when a female human is on her menstrual cycle. And there has been instances, I forget who did the video. I'll have to try to find it and see if I can send it out in the follow-up email. But definitely, if a female is on a menstrual cycle, they can certainly pick that up. There has been a lot of studies that looked at that. Now, late season, this is when I really start to hunt again. I normally kind of again take off December. It's a little slow for me. But late season, that kind of what I consider late season is really after Christmas through the end of the season through kind of mid-January. This is by far my favorite time to hunt outside of rut. I'm focused on weather. That's really all I'm focused on. If I can find where deer are feeding and I can play the weather correctly, I'm going to have success. And what I'm looking for with weather is changing weather patterns, whether it goes from 5 to 7 days of just cold temperatures and then you have a warm front come in. I want to hunt that first day of the warm front. If you have 5 or 6 days of warm and then you have a cold front come through, I want to hunt that first day of the cold front. And I'm also really only focused on afternoon hunts. I certainly will still hunt a morning if it's just perfect. There's fresh snow on the ground. It's hard to beat hunting in the snow, but I like to do a lot of afternoon hunts because deer at this time of year, they really only have one thing on their mind. They just finished breeding. Now, on average, a buck can lose up to 20% of his body weight during rut. And so he really needs to start building up his fat reserves. And does at the same time, they lose a lot of significant body weight. And so they really need to start rebuilding those fat reserves for the impending winter. And food is starting to become a little bit more scarce on the landscape. And so you're going to have these really concentrated areas of heavy feeding, and that's where I'm looking for. And that's why I really focus on, again, these kind of changing weather patterns, but also on snow events, because a fresh snow is basically like a snapshot in time. I can walk out there that next morning, look for sign and say, okay, this is where they're feeding at last night, or this is where they're feeding at this morning. I have the most up-to-date information I could ever have just based on being able to look at their tracks in the snow. And so I'm always looking for snow events and changing weather patterns to help me, especially in late season. But again, it's very common to see. I was hunting a piece of public land here in East Central Illinois with my wife 2 years ago, and we were set up in a bottomland right after a snow. It was probably January 8th or 9th, somewhere kind of in that time frame. And I kid you not, we literally saw 40 deer from one single stand. Just because, again, that's where the food was. The food was really scarce everywhere else. It's covered by snow. It's been consumed. Some of it's been rotted away. The corn and soybeans are all harvested. All the leftovers been eaten, and so it really does concentrate their feeding behavior. And if you can find that feeding area, you can have the hunt of a lifetime in the late season.
Hey Dan,
Yes.
on the 35th doe, if you just want to shoot me a text,
Yeah.
just be like, "Hey, you might want to head over here. I found all the deer."
I tell you, and it was one of the strange. We didn't even get a shot at one of them because it was one of those. There was almost so many eyes, but it was literally like a train of them. It wasn't because we didn't hunt the actual food source. We kind of just got lucky and happened to be between the bed and the food, and it was literally just a single file line of like 30 to 35, just constant. There was bucks mixed in, a bunch of little young bucks. There wasn't really any big bucks at that point, but
Mhm.
my goodness, it was wild.
Dude, I don't know what I saw when I was a kid. I hunted the same field for 10 years. And it's on either side of it was oh gee, a cedar patch. There was like thicket cedar
Ah,
patches on either side, and it was later season. But I hunted that field for years, and I've seen maybe it's max 6 deer in that field at any given time. And this one time, 100 deer came walking out. I mean, it was
it,
like a scene from Braveheart when like one guy comes over the hill and then 1,000 guys come over the hill. I mean, it was insane. I don't know what happened. I couldn't pick a deer out to shoot. There were so many
yeah,
of them. I
exactly.
mean, it was
Yeah.
insane.
And
Anyway,
that's what the late season is all about, is when you see one, chances are you're going to see them in big numbers. That's
yeah.
cool.
It was a sight to see for sure.
Yeah.
All right, I'll give you a break, bud. How about I talk about some land access?
Sounds good.
All right. So definitely one problem that we always have as hunters in any state, really, but definitely in Illinois, it's here, is finding some access and finding somewhere to go. So just so you guys know, the state is broken down. If you ever go to a DNR site, on the website, I should say. So this always gets complicated whenever I talk about site or website. I'll try to do the full website. But so the map is broken down into 5 different regions. And so just to keep that organized for you, that's the different regions right there if you've never seen that map before. And there's different types of land in Illinois. So there's federal land, state land, county land, as well as the IRAP program. If you don't know anything about that, make sure to look into it. We have a whole webinar on it, and you can also just Google it. That's the private land that is being entered into a program that there's lotteries for it, and you can get access to your own private land with people who are working with the state. So it's a great program to try to get some more land for people to use for recreational activity. And then of course there's private land. So only about a little over 1% of the state is public land that we have to access. And through surveys, we found that a lot of our participants do hunt public land. A lot of traditional hunters a lot of them are on private land right now. So it's not as crowded as you might think. A majority of already established hunters mainly hunt private land. But so here's a map of the different sites that are across the state. You can see with the majority population being up in Chicago, there's a couple sites here and there. There's a lot of these have some interesting regulations that you should definitely look up. There's maybe some lotteries to go and hunt. There may only be a couple hunters allowed on at any given time. And then you have this next band that start around here. This is all about an hour or more outside the city. And then you can see that it kind of is diverse throughout the state. And then there's a lot along the river. This is going to be a lot of waterfowl sites. And then the Shawnee National Forest down here, and a lot of not that much population. So there's a lot of woods and things down here. So if you ever want to travel and you can't find anywhere to hunt, just head to the south part of the state and you'll probably be able to find some spot where not many people are at. So that's kind of the breakdown of how the public land is laid out across Illinois. So to try to figure out which one of these to go to, so I would suggest looking early and trying to understand what site you're interested in going to. And I'm going to tell you how to kind of narrow down which one to pick. But learn the site specific regulations for that site and make sure you understand them. So that way you're comfortable going out there. Make sure you're not going to be breaking any laws by accident here. So one place to start is to kind of get an idea. Go to the internet and try to find which sites are near you or in an area of the state that you're willing to drive to, and then compare and contrast them. So you can go and look at the public land hunting report, and this gives the hunt site per acre. So the amount of hunting acres there are per site, as well as hunt trips, and then the different wildlife there that has been taken from there. So any of these sites that you go to that are public sites, you probably have to fill out a windshield card, and this is where this information comes from. So you can see how many different species were harvested from different spots. So you can see here, just kind of strolling down, Banner Marsh, for instance, had 31 deer taken with bow. So that seems to be a really good population of deer right there that you can go and try to get on Banner Marsh. But then also there were 2,500 hunting trips taken. So it also seems like it's a very popular site, but it is 3,000 acres. So we can see here that it's a large site. So kind of use those numbers to see if it's a site worth going to, if it's overpressured, and if there's a good population of animals there that you're trying to harvest. So here is an example using Moraine View. Again, kind of highlighting the same numbers that I just talked about. And you can get like a deer abundance estimate. So looking at deer harvested per acre, as well as a hunting effort. So deer harvested per hunting trip. And not all the time are they going to come out to where they're the same. The trips are very similar to the amount of acres that are there. So they're basically the same number. But and then you can look at hunter abundance as well. So how many hunters are there per acre? So there's about 1 hunter there per acre.
And I use that a lot. It just gives such a good direct comparison from site to site, like you said.
Yep.
It is one of those, and it's kind of hard to find on DNR's website, but if you just Google Illinois DNR Public Lands Hunting Report, it'll pull it up right away.
Dan, remind me, we might be able to like take this data and kind of rank the sites in a way, but then I don't want to blow up different sites. So you guys can do that yourself.
Yeah,
but,
yeah, exactly.
You could definitely just take this and put it in an Excel spreadsheet and just kind of rank that and put an equation in there to figure out which ones are the best ones to go to. But all right, so then there's a new website out. I will give a slight disclaimer is that make sure that it's updated. Unfortunately, this is one of those things where we build it and then it kind of is just sitting there. It needs to be kind of updated once in a while.
They are hiring a full-time staff member to manage this website. So this coming season, it should really see some good growth.
Good. And that's because I've said that on every webinar. So they, no, I'm kidding. But yeah, so good. So make sure it's updated and it should be. So that's awesome because this is actually a really good site. They put together a good site. The DNR did a great job on this. And traditionally, just to give you a heads up on what it used to be, like if you went to the DNR website, it would give you a list of sites by alphabetical order and not tell you where they were at. They might give you the region, but then never really telling you where they are. So this helps you search them by your county or your town or near me and everything else to organize it so that we don't have to click on every single site to open its map up to see where it was towards where you were. So this is a huge improvement compared to an alphabetical list. So like I just said, so you can start off by starting where you're at and you can do a specific site or near me. For this, we're doing a specific site and we're going to look at Moraine View. And then from there, it gives you all this information. So this is the typical things that you would have found on the Hunter Fact Sheet on the old website. So you just do this little drop down tab. You can see here there's a minus, so this all drop down. And you can look at the specific site regulation because each of these sites have more regulations than just the statewide regulations. So again, get yourself familiar with whatever site you're planning on hunting. And here you can even see like open only on Mondays and Tuesdays during controlled pheasant season. So Moraine View is a big spot for the controlled pheasant hunts. So they want to make sure that their pheasant hunters have opportunity out there. So they're limiting the archery hunts out there. So so even though the site says that it allows archery hunting, you're only allowed Monday and Tuesday during the pheasant season. So it's
here's a pro tip I want to throw in here real quick. Sorry, Jason.
Go for it.
A site like this, when I see that, that's sending a bunch of like light bulbs above my head because that's automatically. And I understand not everybody can hunt Mondays and Tuesdays. It's difficult for everybody. But if you can work it out to where you can maybe hunt a Monday afternoon or a Tuesday afternoon, if that's all that site can allow, there's a lot of hunters who are just going to forego even spending the time scouting or even thinking about that site. So a lot of times when I see stuff like that, I get a little excited and a little intrigued because that's going to reduce the number of people that are out there.
There you go. Yeah, whenever you see something that's restrictive, that you say good, that means that people aren't going to want to do it, and I'll do it. So there you go. So again, just reference all these different site-specific regs. And then this website also has a map feature. So you can open up a map and see a map of the site, and then you can click on the different species over here to see where you're allowed to hunt. So here you can see that archery season is clicked, and you can see where the allowable hunting area is at. So basically, you're not allowed to hunt along the lake there. I think there might be a campground up in there as well, and then around these different buildings. So they don't allow hunting around there, but you can hunt basically anywhere else. And you can also see the different parking lots. So all the blue P's are all the parking lots. There may be a check-in station at the site. So that's going to be your check-in. Your eye is going to be your information. So the site office, I'm sure, is right in this area. So you might have to go
Yeah,
check in
it's
there
just
first.
such a good tool to be able to visually see everything on the site in like one quick snapshot.
Yes. And again, to say how much better this is than the old way is to give them even the benefit, even though they weren't updating it all the time, was there used to be like an old campground drawn map on some of these old hunter fact sheets. I mean, they're hand drawn maps or something like that. And it was always kind of iffy. I mean, people who are starting a new activity such as hunting, they want to make sure they're not breaking a law. I mean, there's so many laws that go along with this. We don't want to be in the areas you're not allowed to hunt in. So being able to visually see this now is just a benefit for everybody. So when you're looking at this, you kind of want to start marking up a map. So the purple and yellow areas are areas that you're not allowed to hunt, or it's around different facility buildings. And then the red areas are going to be kind of away from parking lots. Now, this isn't to say that a deer might not be in one of these parking lots or right on the outside of one of these parking lots. This could be great deer activity and a deer habitat, and you may be able to see that. But where this is more just talking about getting away from other hunters on public land, because most hunters won't go more than a quarter mile away from the parking lot. So all these areas are more than a quarter mile away from any given parking lot, and also look like there's some different edge habitat and different variations of habitats, especially up here. You can see this field and this forest as well. So these are different corridors that deer are going to be moving through, and then also edges that they're going to be walking around as well. So these are all areas you want to kind of scout. So it helps narrow down when you look at such a large map. It's like, okay, where do I actually want to spend my time walking around? Because everybody's got stuff to do, and they're all probably driving 40 minutes or more to all these different spots. So when you get there, you got to have a plan. So go ahead, Dan.
Oh yeah, I'll kind of take back over here just because I kind of put together this example.
Go for it.
So when I'm first, Jason just kind of talked about identifying these scouting zones a little bit. When I first pull up a new map, that's what I'm trying to do is just highlight areas that look intriguing. I'm looking for, physical obstructions that might limit other people going there, whether it's distance from parking lot. Sometimes it can be up a steep ridge, or kind of like we talked about earlier, maybe it can be water access that limits other people. And so I just kind of identify a lot of these different scouting quote unquote zones that I want to then go do boots on the ground scouting. And while I'm scouting, there's a few things that I really focus on. I want to think about how I'm going to get to that area, how I'm going to get in, how I'm going to get out, because that's all important. But also, where can I hunt with different wind directions? And I oftentimes will take a little notepad with me, and I'm jotting all of this down so that when I go to make that decision to hunt, it is very quick and easy. All I have to do is go, okay, okay, okay. I need to bring this kind of tree stand. I'm going to hunt with a ground blind here. I can hunt this with a west or an east wind, and I'll just start to really take all of this in so that when you go to make that decision to hunt that stand, now you just pull out your notes and boom, you know exactly what you need, you know exactly when you can hunt it, what the sign looked like. And so I really am a big proponent of taking field notes while you're out there scouting. And I should kind of highlight, I have one bullet here that's called "If allowable, create shooting lanes and access trails." That's mainly talking about private land. On public land, we cannot legally remove any vegetation or cut any vegetation. So don't really focus on that if you're hunting public land. But if you're on private land, that's something certainly you can look into, is creating shooting lanes to remove some vegetation so you have a clear path to the trail that you expect the deer to be on. Or on public land, you have to be a little bit more strategic with where you're actually putting your stand so that you can make sure you have that open. And that's one thing I will commonly do, is actually when I'm out scouting, bring a tree stand with me so that when I'm scouting, I can get up in that tree and see, maybe, because I'll tell you, the woods look completely different from the ground than they do 20 feet up in a tree. And if all you're scouting is just down here, you may get up in the tree and go, oh my God, I can't see that trail at all. And so oftentimes if I find a spot I really want to hunt, even pre-season, I'll quickly put up a tree stand, get up there and see what it looks like, see if it meets all my criteria, and if I can actually get a safe and effective shot off. But you also don't have to hunt from a tree. I'll tell you, the past 3 to 4 years, I've drastically reduced the amount of time that I use a tree stand. And I bow hunt public land, and now I do a lot of it on the ground, and it can be certainly effective. You don't have to get in the tree to harvest deer or to harvest a mature buck. You can certainly do it on the ground. But be kind of thinking about all those things while you're out there scouting. That's kind of the thought process that goes through my mind when I'm scouting. Is it's not so much scouting, but it's also kind of hunt planning is kind of how I like to think about it.
Yep. And also, if you come across areas where you see people, like I'll see like one or two branches snap to here and there, and I might not do anything about it, but I have seen trees cut down, and I could see where a tree's at, where a guy's probably in a tree stand. And don't be afraid to call the CO and just alert them of it. I mean, maybe if they're in they might not come out immediately. It might not be an emergency, but if they're in the area and they're walking around, they know, hey, down this trail's where that one guy said trees were cut down. They might pop down there and see if anyone's on that stand or not. I mean, you're the eyes and ears out there. A lot of COs take care of a lot of different counties, and I know they have a lot to worry about, but still, it's your land and people are out there damaging it.
All right, so we'll move into a kind of a quick example here to wrap up. So we're going to kind of imagine this place. We're hunting it November 5th, so that early November. The deer are really starting to, the bucks are really starting to chase the does around. We have, a little bit of wind coming from the northeast, and our goal is kind of to identify potential stand locations. So if you want to go ahead and kind of move to the next slide, Jason, I'll kind of show, and again, this is a spot I've set up and hunted before, and this is kind of what I came up with. I found these does were bedding in kind of this bottom little field here. And you can see this area I've marked out with feeding was basically a nice oak flat that had a bunch of white oaks. It also had some red oaks mixed in there. So there was just a really good acorn crop. And it was very, very prevalent that does were feeding there and just basically going back and forth. They didn't have to really leave the cover. They could be safe and secure from a variety of different wind directions. So if you'll go to the next slide, I kind of have 4 kind of areas that you may want to target. So just kind of think about really quick whether you would set up in maybe A, B, C, or D. And again, you can see that wind direction coming kind of from the northeast, or I guess my camera's reversed, but from the northeast down. Now, I will say there are basically 2 spots I would probably hunt. If you want to go ahead and move on to the next slide, Jason, we'll talk about the first one.
Sure. And Dan, that one question was, when you come into a spot, how do you not alert deer?
Oh yeah, good. Thank you for bringing that up. This is exactly where I wanted to talk about it. Yeah,
that's what I was thinking too. I just want to remind you of that.
Yeah. So if you want to just quickly go, yeah, perfect.
Yep.
And so this would be kind of my preferred location. Again, I'm catching that buck cruising on the downwind side. So he's searching the downwind side of that feeding area. He's searching the downwind side of that bedding area, and he's gonna just naturally following along the contours of the land. But when I'm in an area like this specific spot, if you were to try to get in here from the north in any way, shape, or form, you're gonna blow that entire spot out. And so pay attention to the wind, not only from where you're sitting in your stand, but also your approach to the stand, because that's just as important. If you can get in your stand and the wind's perfect, but the whole time you're trying to get there, you're blowing scent all over the bedding and the feeding area, you're just kind of really doing yourself a disservice. And so it's in this specific case, I would prefer to not hunt B, just because sneaking in, I would have to get so darn close to that bedding area that chances are I would kind of have to sneak in. And now in this specific example, the western portion of this map where Jason's kind of drawing is actually almost private land. And what's really nice is if you can get access to walk through that private land. It's not very easy to get access to deer hunt on private land. There's just a lot of people that deer hunt already, and a lot of people ask, and there's people have liability concerns, and oftentimes they'll say no. But asking to just be able to walk through their property can oftentimes work out pretty well. And so in this case, that would be my kind of preferred route, would be to come in from kind of the southwest to make sure that my wind isn't blowing over that bedding area exactly right, kind of like where Jason's drawing, and kind of sneak in that way. And again, I'm doing this, if it's a morning hunt, I'm doing this ideally about an hour and a half before sunrise. So legal shooting time, if you remember from Deer Hunting 101, starts 30 minutes before sunrise. I personally like to be completely set up in my location, quiet and calm down 30 minutes before shooting light. And so so that kind of puts it at, I want to be set up an hour before sunrise. And that just really helps me get in there, lets the woods kind of calm down a little bit for about 30 minutes before that sun starts to really shine some light, and you're into legal shooting light. So typically I'm sneaking through those woods very quietly. I don't use a ton of light. Obviously, some people, if you have a little fear of the dark, you can certainly use a flashlight. What I have found to be quite effective is just a headlight on a very low setting, and I like to use red light. It doesn't, there's kind of some misnomers about red light. There's a lot of people say, oh, the wildlife can't see the red light. They certainly still can, but what it really does is it preserves your night vision. If you were to, just walk out, because it's what, 4 o'clock in the morning when you may be, leaving your vehicle, and you just turn on a bright flashlight. The second you turn it off, all your night vision's gone. And that red little low light allows you to kind of keep that night vision, and allows you to, over time, you'll start to be able to see a lot better than you would if you just had one big kind of white light. So we kind of talked a little bit about bee. Again, that's a little close to the bedding area for me. It can certainly still be effective. I probably would not do that on a morning sit, because chances are I would bust all those does out of there. I would ruin that bedding area and kind of have to start from scratch. So my preferred location would actually be kind of target D. So that puts me a little bit further away from the bedding area, puts me kind of right between the bedding and feeding, but I'm still on the downwind side of that. So as the does are kind of traveling from bed to feed or from feed to bed, that wind is still in the proper direction. And if a buck is kind of cruising there, still searching those feeding and those bedding areas, you're still going to be in kind of a pretty prime position to be able to make a play on that buck. And so that's kind of what I really like to focus on, is not pushing super close to the bed. I oftentimes will lead a little bit more to the feeding side, just to give myself a little bit of wiggle room. And obviously, if you start to notice that all the deer are coming by at last light or after legal light, well, then I might, my next sit, I might get a little bit closer to the bed, maybe 100 yards or so, and see if you can make that play to where they're a little bit closer, and they're walking by you within those legal lights. All right. Well, with that, that kind of concludes our webinar tonight. I do want to talk about a big event we have coming up on October 1st, so just a few short weeks away. We're calling it Hunt Camp, and this is going to be a really interesting way to win some mentored hunts, to win a bunch of different gear we're going to have. We have sponsorships from Onyx Map, Hunt Stand, Vortex Optics, Icatech Game Calls, Duke Traps. There's going to be a ton of stuff given away, a ton of mentored hunts given away. I know I'm doing a deer hunt, I'm doing an upland hunt, I'm doing a few squirrel hunts. Jason, I know you're doing a waterfowl hunt, and I think a squirrel hunt. So there's going to be tons of different hunts given away. It's going to be a fun event. So if you're interested in that, check out our website, learntohuntil.com, or go to our Facebook page. We've been kind of posting about it quite regularly. But it should be a good event, and we hope to see you all there.
Yeah. Yep. I'll be going. I'll have a deer hunt too. So I think we're gonna do a group squirrel,
nice.
and then me, you, yourself, Curtis, and I will be going out on a waterfowl hunt with one other person, and then I'll do a deer.
Yeah,
hunt
it's gonna be fun.
And hey, if you like any of these maps that you saw, I'll take you to where
Exactly.
where that map photo was at. But yeah, if anyone has any questions, shoot them our way. If you don't have any right now, you can always email us, follow us on our social media pages. Our biggest wealth of knowledge right now is definitely has been our YouTube page, because we have put all of our webinars up on YouTube. So feel free to go there and watch old ones. We also have instructional videos, and our podcasts are there as well as being on iTunes and Spotify. So YouTube has become like our big knowledge sink right now. But if you're interested in updates or season updates or lottery updates for the seasons, or updates on our program, on the different webinars or workshops we'll be having, you can look at our newsletter. Also, our Facebook and Instagram pages are really good for those as well. We try not to be annoying, but as we have big events like Hunt Camp, we are promoting it pretty strong. Sorry about it. With that, if you guys have any questions at all, please let us know. And we appreciate you all joining us tonight, and you have a great evening.
Yeah, and
go
sorry
from
we
there.
ran a little bit late, so we won't stick around too long for questions.
Yep.
But like Jason said, shoot us an email, Facebook message. We're happy to talk to you.
Awesome. All right. With that, I think we're gonna get out of here. So
All right. Well, have a great night, everybody, and happy fall.
yep. Great job, guys. We'll see you.